I thought I had them on.
For those who are joining us for our Bible study, this is week 2 of our study of Father Lawrence Boat's book, Reading the Old Testament. I like this book for a few reasons. One, because it's frankly, one of the best books, one of the easiest books to read on this. You might disagree when you read these pages. But also, he taught at the school where I studied in Washington, D.C. He was a Paulist father who taught at the Washington Theological Union in Washington, D.C., which is where I studied for 3 years. So this book was required reading for all of us who went through that school. If you'd like to get a copy of it, it's 600 pages of reading all about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. Chapter 2 brings us up to the Patriarchs and the Matriarchs. I know that in the chapter it just talks about the Patriarchs, but we recognize that now in the 21st century we're more inclusive, and we know that Abraham could not have had a child without Sarah. So we'll refer to them as the Patriarchs and the Matriarchs: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah and Rachel. Did I just say that he had 2 wives? We'll come to that in a moment. Before we get into this, though, I think it's important for us to understand some of the geography. So let's take a look at this together. For those who are joining us on Facebook, this is also posted in the handouts in the link below. Let's take a look at the geography of the Bible. So here, at the very bottom of the page where it says the flow of Bible history, it essentially talks about it. This is going to take the entire Bible. Where are all the places that are mentioned in the Bible, and where do we put them on a map? You'll notice the United States are not anywhere on this map. Nothing in the Bible talks about anything that happened in the United States or in North America or South America or Australia or other parts of the world. There are other scriptures. Have you heard of the Book of Mormon? Who reads the Book of Mormon?
Mormons.
Mormons believe, and I'll never forget, it was maybe 25 years ago now that Mormons knocked on my door and said they'd like to talk to me about Jesus, and I said, come on in, I'm waiting to talk about Jesus. I love when people come to my front door talking about Jesus. So I invited them in, and they took out a piece of paper and they explained that when Jesus, they drew Jesus, they said when Jesus ascended into the heavens, he came down in Mexico. And so the Book of Mormon talks about Jesus appearing in the New World. Much the same way that things like Our Lady of Guadalupe and that legend talks about Mary in the New World. So we can imagine some things taking place in North America. However, the Bible is all written in this part of the world where Jesus lived and where Jesus ascended. The very bottom of the page then, we're going to go through some numbers together to sort of situate where these things took place. Up above that, the more colorful graphic is a modern day map so that we can compare the two. I tried to make them roughly the same size so that, for instance, you can see the peninsula where Turkey is located up above and below to sort of situate where were things happening back in biblical times versus what countries would that be today. Should we take a look first at the most colorful map? Turkey sticks out as the big green country. Turkey. There's a pink country to Turkey's right that is not labeled. That's Iran. You can see Iraq is the purple country. Syria, another pink country along the Mediterranean Sea. Saudi Arabia we see, and Egypt. I cropped this one down farther than the other one simply so that we can see where Egypt and Saudi Arabia are. You can see the country of Jordan, and then really small on this map is the country of Israel. Israel does not have diplomatic relations with all countries, so that, for instance, if you are from Israel or if you are Jewish, you will not be going to Saudi Arabia anytime soon because they won't let you in. So, that's modern day, the modern day world with all the countries. Now let's take a look below. Find the number 1. Where does this map start? This map starts on the lower right-hand side. See the number 1? That's modern day Iraq. So those who are from Iraq, actually where I'm from, in the cornfields of Ohio, there are thousands of people who go there every year from Iraq. They call themselves Chaldeans. And they say that they come from the cradle of civilization because this is where the Bible situates the Garden of Eden. Number one, Garden of Eden. So up above then, when we start explaining where these things are, if you take a look up at number one, the Garden of Eden, present day Iraq, which was why the Pope's visit last week to Iraq was so important. The first time that a Pope has ever gone to Iraq. What's so important about Iraq? Because according to these stories, if you take a look at where Iraq is situated here versus where it is down here, we start seeing that stories like the Garden of Eden and Babylon, the Tower of Babel, Abraham, all of these things are going to be situated in present-day Iraq. We tend to think of that part of the world, people from Iran, Iraq, as bad, evil people. That's, according to them, the cradle of civilization, that we all come from there. Our faith tradition started there. Garden of Eden. Number two is Mount Ararat. We see that in the north in modern-day Turkey. Noah in the ark. They talk about the ark landing on a mountain, Mount Ararat. Where is Mount Ararat? Oh, we trace that up to there. How interesting that it is that far away. We know the Bible is not a book of history. It's a book of theology. It tells us what people believed about God. Obviously, the people that were passing down these stories generation after generation. We're talking about the ark landing on Mount Ararat. Where's Mount Ararat? That's way north. In fact, farther north than anything else on this map. Number three, the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis as well. Genesis chapter 11, modern day Iraq. Going to number four, Ur, the city of Ur. That's where Abraham is from. How interesting that according to the story, if the story were to be believed as history, Noah ended up at number 2 with the flood at Mount Ararat. But then his son Shem settled down in Ur in modern-day Iraq. And 8 generations later, his great-great-great-great-great-grandson Terah had 3 sons in that city of Ur, whose names were Haran, Nahor, and Abram. Ooh, have you heard of Abram before? He's going to be later renamed Abraham. And the other name that's important there is Haran, Lot's father. Lot is going to be a figure that we find in Abraham's story. So Lot is going to be one of Abraham's nephews. Yeah, one of Abraham's nephews. From there, we go to number 5 in the map below. Ooh, look, 5 is a big journey. To go from Ur in present-day Iraq, it goes to the west and then up north to Haran, a city named after their father, and then down south to what looks like it's heading in the direction of Jerusalem. So if you look at number 5 up above, after Haran's death, his 70-year-old younger brother Abram traveled to Haran in present-day Turkey, then to Canaan, which is somewhere in that part of the world around Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. We'll say Israel for now because we know that Israel was named for Jacob. Do you remember that when we put it up here? Abraham gave birth to Isaac. Isaac gave birth to Jacob. Jacob took on another name, Israel. What we're going to see in a moment when we flip this map over is that Israel is going to try this strategy of bringing people together by telling them, even though we're different tribes, we all descend from the same person. Let's call him Israel or Jacob. All of us, as different as we are, we have more in common, and that separates us because we all go back to the same ancestor. That's the story that we would tell them to try to unite us. Going back to the map then. So Abraham's journey was number 5, which was actually quite a trek. He was called from his homeland in Ur and eventually made it over to the land of the Canaanites. Number 6. So Abraham had a son whose name was Isaac. Isaac had a son whose name was Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. The 11th was Joseph. Do you remember the story of Joseph in Egypt? Joseph in the Technicolor dream coat. Joseph, the one who could interpret dreams. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. That's how we go from 5 to number 6, which is in Egypt. because Joseph was sold into slavery and found himself rising to power in Egypt. All of his brothers came to Egypt, and so that was the Israelites explaining where they came from, that they came out of Egypt. Number 7 was after they were freed from slavery. Remember that story? Moses freed them from slavery, took them out of Egypt, and followed number 7 to Mount Sinai. Huh. So far so good? Mount Sinai, after we're in Mount Sinai, the arrow that goes up to number 8 then is our 40 years in the desert, eventually ending up with us going north. At number 8 it says, Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land, again the land of the Canaanites, back where Abraham had settled, where they were led by various judges until the first king. The first king's name was Saul. After Saul came David, who united that region. It's just helping us to get a bit of an idea of where some of these things are located. I'm just realizing, did we skip over the Tower of Babel on number 3, or did I say anything about number 3? Number 3, had I said anything about it, in Babylon would be where the Tower of Babel was. Have you heard that Bible story before? Genesis chapter 11, how it was that they wanted to, believing that God is up, they said, oh, let's build a tower as high as we can, and we're going to reach God. According to the ancient story, of course, the tower fell at some point, and it was their etiological explanation, their way of explaining why it is that we speak different languages. That God struck down the tower and made us all speak different languages so that I can't understand you and you can't understand me, and that's where all the languages of the world came from. Tower of Babel. When other people are babbling and you can't understand them, traces it back to number 3, Babylon. Let's see, where do we leave off? In Jerusalem, number 8. Number 9 then, after David and Solomon ruled over the united kingdom, the land was split into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. In 723, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V conquered Samaria and took a lot of people as prisoners. That's number 9. You can see the first deportation went in the direction of Nineveh. The second deportation, number 10, went in the direction when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. Have you heard of that name before? Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, deported us and destroyed our temple, took us into Babylon. Remember last Sunday's responsorial psalm, by the streams of Babylon we sat and wept. There we hung up our harps in the tree because we could no longer sing the happy songs that we sang when we were back in Jerusalem. We were deported. That's about 600 miles from Jerusalem to Babylon that we were deported. Brings the number 11. Number 11, you notice, is going from Babylon back to Jerusalem. That's when Cyrus, the king of the Persians, again going back to last Sunday's first reading, talked about Cyrus coming along and letting us go free and to go back to our homeland. So after picking up all the stories in Babylon about things like the Tower of Babel and Noah's Ark, then we came back to Jerusalem, where we rebuilt the temple. So far so good. We didn't anticipate learning biblical geography tonight. So 11, once that brings us back to 11 then, back to Jerusalem, that was in 539 BC, and we were happily living in Jerusalem, in those two kingdoms, the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel. That's where Jesus was raised. And so that's essentially where Jewish history stops. If we wanted to continue with the life of Jesus, Jesus lived around the area of Jerusalem and parts north of Jerusalem. But then after Jesus died, that brings us to number 12. Paul started preaching about how it was that Jesus not only died, but also rose again. Where did Paul preach? Follow number 12. Number 12 starts in Antioch, which is in modern-day Turkey. Follow 12, it goes all the way up to Philippi in present-day Greece. Goes back to Jerusalem through the sea. He took a boat back to Jerusalem. See that at number 12? That's Paul's journey. Number 13, Paul is sent from Caesarea to Rome, where he was put on trial. You can see that he was shipped over to Rome. File number 13 goes from Jerusalem over to Rome. He was acquitted, so he got off free. the person who drew this map believes that St. Paul traveled to Spain and perhaps even to Britain. I don't think that there are many serious scholars who believe that, but that's number 14 and number 15 by whoever created this map. Oh, after that, Paul went to Spain. I don't believe Paul ever made it to Spain. Number 16 then is Paul going from, excuse me, not Paul, but actually John. After that, the story transfers from Rome to Patmos, which is where John is exiled and writes the book of Revelation. I should say where John wrote the book of Revelation. And then finally, John died in Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, which is why it ends up in number 17. So all the events of the Bible are captured in that map at the bottom of the page. Nothing in the Bible took place in all of Africa outside of Egypt. Nothing in the Bible took place in other parts of Europe, other parts of Asia, Australia, North, Central, South America. Nothing. That is biblical geography. Mario?
Well, back in history classes I had, the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers were in other words, that was a center of almost civilization at that time.
Those are those rivers flowing through
Very
Iraq.
productive. They could produce all kinds with the water. And there's a movie that Bob Hope, you're too young to remember. Bob Hope made a movie, Road to Baghdad, and it's about how beautiful that place used to be. I remember when I was a young boy, I saw that movie, and it showed fountains, and I mean, a very productive area. That's
Very
why.
nice.
But at that time, the Muslim world
There were no Muslims.
wasn't around yet. And then later,
Of the 7th century.
after probably 1,000 years later, no? By the time Muhammad,
So Mario's remembering a geography lesson, the Euphrates River in modern day Iraq. See the rivers that are flowing through Iraq there? So imagine when they talk about the Garden of Eden being on the Euphrates River, the Bible refers to it as the Great River. From the Great River to the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, was that essentially that was the biblical world for our Jewish ancestors. That was the part of the world that we come from. It's important for us to understand this part of the world then, because a lot of what we believe traces back to what was happening in that part of the world 2 to 3 to 4,000 years ago. Ready to turn that map over? On the other side then, we're focusing more on the northern kingdom of Judah, of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and we see various cities. This is different from the other map that we've seen, because the other map is in Jesus' time, so this gives us an idea of some of the cities that were in Jesus' time. This is even farther back, so that when we hear the stories of Abraham traveling to various cities, like Shechem, we're able to look on this map and be able to start placing where some of those took place. As we saw in this, when Abraham, on the other side, when Abraham was traveling then, Abraham came from Iraq, which is off this map. He went north, and then he came down and settled into this area, the land of the Canaanites. See where the Canaanites are on this map? Roughly there, I see 3 instances of Canaanites, essentially with Abraham settling somewhere around those areas. These are going to be important because remember last week's lesson, when we started talking about people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we have different authors. We often refer to them as J, the Yahwist author, E, the Elohist author, the priestly author. One of these authors finds him or herself in the north, and so they're going to have different names in the north, but also they're going to have more sites saying Jacob once rested here in the north. People in the south can't say that, right? Abraham came up and down and landed in the land of the Canaanites. Any comments on this before we jump into chapter 2 of Father Boat's book? Mario?
well, I was thinking about Jerusalem. Okay, in Jerusalem, there's supposed to be, what, 3 or 4 religions right there by the wall?
Currently, some of
Okay,
it
the
is
Jewish,
Judaism,
the
Christian,
Christian,
Catholics.
the
Muslims.
Palestinian,
Yeah.
Muslim. So, at one, I remember that at one time, there was like a little, there's no hills up, I mean, there's no mountains up there, but they have some hills in Jerusalem. And they claim that Muhammad went on to heaven from there. The Christians and the Jewish people kind of abandoned that part of land, right? Is that correct?
So how interesting. What we're going to see if we continue this map, or actually look back at this side, people like Mohammed then are going to be coming from present-day Saudi Arabia, so that
Yeah.
same part of the world, essentially. When Muslims today make their trek, their Mecca, their pilgrimage to that part of the world, they're going back to where Muhammad was believed to have lived, which was in present-day Saudi Arabia. So that same part of the world, the cradle of civilization, we call it, because eventually people spread from places like this throughout Europe, throughout Africa, throughout Asia.
So they see.
This map is important because this gives an idea of all the tribes that were found around there. You can see the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Perizzites and the Girgashites, right? All the different tribes. As Israelites, we had this idea. We were worshiping the God of our ancestors, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. You were worshiping your ancestors, but what if our story, or if I might, what if Grandpa Rudy's story was how it was that us living here and the Jebusites living beside us, we aren't so different. In fact, we descend from the same family of Israel, or Jacob, who had 12 sons. And those 12 sons each went on to essentially have its own tribe, its own people. And so it's only natural. We believe in God expressed one way, the Jebusites believe in their God expressed another way, but if you trace us all back, us as Israelites, and you as Jebusites, we all go back to the same family. We descend from Jacob, who was later called Israel, and his 12 sons, so that there are all these tribes that descended from them. We all worship the same God. You're a Jebusite and I'm an Israelite, but if we were to trace ourselves back, we said, we'd find out that your ancestors and our ancestors came from the same place. So let's just say that we believe in the same God.
Well, sometimes, we get into a lot of debates about Adam and Eve, and we believe that there were Adam and Eves in all parts of the world. I mean, evolution.
There you go.
Because some people claim, well, Adam and Eve had 2 sons. Where did they come from? I mean, they couldn't have had relations with their mom.
I'm not gonna sit
Fancy
close
words
to you.
is-
I mean,
Since we're learning all sorts of fancy words, the fancy word that we use as anthropologists is it's an etiological explanation. We look for ways to explain things, and etiology is the study of where things come from. So that a few weeks ago we had the story of the rainbow. Where does the rainbow come from? We had an etiological explanation of where the rainbow came from, that God flooded the world, and then after it was over, God had put the rainbow, an ark, in the sky as a sign of God's promise that he would never do that again. It was an etiological explanation. The creation story was an etiological explanation. Where do we all come from? Well, we trace ourselves all the way back to the first 2 people. Now, what doesn't make sense about that story, we later found out, was that Adam and Eve, who were in the garden, had 3 sons and no daughters. So obviously, Grandpa Rudy, when he told that story, didn't help us to understand how Adam and Eve had all sorts of grandkids. You follow me? But the Bible is filled with all sorts of theological explanations, right? They didn't account for, where do darker-skinned persons in other parts of the world come from? Where do persons who look different in other parts of the world come from? Their story is, we all trace ourselves back to this first couple.
Orangutan.
And their kids. So take a look at Father Boat's book. Father Boat's book, chapter 2. The Patriarchs and Matriarchs. Think of them as national heroes, right? We have all of these tribes. If we were to trace them all back, then we could trace them all back to the same family of heroes. We're all related in that way. One family lived in northern Mesopotamia. The family tree of Abraham, who is the grandfather, and then who gave birth to Isaac, who gave birth to Jacob. Essentially how it is that this story starts to trace this one family. The Bible starts with the story of creation and then the story of the flood, and after that we get the stories of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. At the bottom of page 133, their etiological or eponymous writings is the word, this fancy word that's used here, a way of being able to help them fix the roots of where these people came from. Such that, for instance, the firstborn son of the daughters of Lot was named Moab. He's the father of the Moabites today. Did you ever stop and think, why do we call ourselves Moabites in this tribe? Oh. We would go to an elder, Grandpa Joe, and ask, Grandpa Joe, why do we call ourselves Moabites? And Grandpa Joe would tell us. Well, that's because we descend from these people and we trace ourselves all the way back to Moab. Oh. It became convenient for us because knowing there were various tribes in that area, suddenly we took a symbolic number 12 and said that 12 different tribes in this area all trace its way back to this family. The younger son, top of page 134 then. We said the story was that the younger son went on to have the Ammonites, which we saw on this page as well. So this page you start seeing, okay, the Moabites, where are they at on this map? Oh, I see them, okay. The Ammonites, where are they? Oh, I see them here. How it was that these neighboring tribes actually descended, according to the stories we were telling, from the same people. Why are we fighting one another? I know, we were taught to hate the Moabites or hate the Ammonites. We are all sisters and brothers. We descend from the same family people. Can't we all just get along? 134, the setting of the patriarchal and matriarchal stories. Before that period, Israel was in Egypt. Before the period in which Israel was in Egypt, so we had these stories of how we came out of Egypt, but we needed to have the stories to explain how we got into Egypt. How do we get into Egypt? Abraham gave birth to, let's follow the chart here again. Abraham, we'll call him Abe for short, gave birth to Isaac, who gave birth to Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. One of those sons was Joseph. It was Joseph who went into Egypt. When all of his brothers followed him into Egypt, that's how we all got into Egypt. See how we're tracing it back and explaining where we came from? So, but before we got into Egypt with Joseph, we were wandering in the desert. So let's trace it back to our ancestors, starting with Abraham. Bottom of page 134, where would we have situated him? In the Negev desert, the scene of much of where Abraham and Isaac would have settled, according to the stories that were told about them. Israel spent about 400 years in Egypt. And then after that, we had the story of Moses getting us out of Egypt. Page 135, Abraham, we imagine, based on the stories that are told of him in the Bible, that he was among the wealthy clans of that time, likely due to his raising of livestock, things like sheep and goats. So imagine them moving with their flocks. If you have lots of goats and lots of sheep, what do you do when they've eaten all the grass in a certain area?
Relocate.
You gotta relocate, right? And so suddenly it becomes this seasonal thing where you imagine a person like Abraham with his extended family and everything that they owned, all the animals that they own, their animals eating up all the grass, and then them having to figure out, okay, it's time for us to go down the road. They eat up all the grass there, and so they have to keep moving down the road. So these were nomads at that time, living more in tents than in cities. These were not city dwellers. Page 135 talks about that semi-nomadic lifestyle that would have been enjoyed by Abraham and Isaac into Jacob. Jacob would have been the first one to begin living a more settled life. In the dry summer season or in the years of drought, they would be wandering pretty far looking for grazing land. Abraham, then, at the bottom of page 135, moved between various places, including Haran, Damascus, Shechem, Hebron, Egypt, all of which were along the caravan routes and the trade routes. So the opening story, about on page 135, opens in Mesopotamia in the city of modern-day Iraq. And then we find the Bible taking them out of Iraq and essentially being called to a new land. The story we told was that God called Abraham to leave the land of his ancestors, and God was going to prepare another land for him, the land of the Canaanites. Pages 136 and 137 outline the various points in the story of Abraham and Isaac. And it gives the chapter numbers before, so Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 9. God calls and blesses Abraham and calls Abraham to move west into Canaan. Follow the map. Began in Iraq, and Ur was called to go north and ended up in the land of the Canaanites. Verses 10 through 12, Abraham risks his blessing in Egypt by giving up Sarah. Yikes, we're going to see him choosing himself over his wife many times, the scoundrel. Abraham and Lot divide their territory. Remember, go ahead.
That's what my daughter says. Men are no damn good.
I hear you. Abraham is going to be pretty rotten, and Isaac too. We see these themes where some scripture scholars believe that it's essentially one story told by three different people, because what's the chance of all these three people doing the same thing and treating women in the same rotten way, doing the same sorts of things? Abraham and Lot divide their territory, and Abraham receives Palestine. Abraham showed himself a hero and blessed in warfare. Back then, the word that we use is Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord God of the armies. That God is on our side when we go into the fight. When the Roman Catholic Church changed the translation of the Mass in 2011, it put that term back into the Holy Holy. We say Lord God of power and might. They changed it to Lord God of hosts, I believe. Essentially, that's a term for the God of the armies. The God marches on our side. Whoa. Abraham risks the blessing in chapter 16 by having a child with his slave Hagar. Right? God says, you're going to be blessed. Your children are going to number as much as look at the stars. That's how many kids you're going to have. He says, I and my wife are both past the time, so maybe I need to be having a relationship with one of my concubines, with Hagar. They did. This is an important story because Ishmael, in chapter 16, would go on, and in our etiology, in our explaining of these stories, we would explain that the Muslims, our Muslim brothers and sisters, descended from Ishmael.
How old did Abraham, how old did he live?
How old did he live? I don't have that answer right with me. We could easily look that up. He was 70 years old when he was called to leave his home and begin the travels. We figure that Abraham and Sarah were somewhere around 90 to 100 years old when they bore the son, according to the story. But again, we remember that this is not a book of history.
Theology.
It's a book of theology. It's trying to tell us that our God is so great that even if you are 90 or 100 years old, if God says you're having a baby, surprise, you're having a baby. Oh, shoot. God renews his promise to Sarah and Abraham in chapter 18. Chapter 18, Abraham shows his blessing by interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah, which was destroyed for its sin of inhospitality. But we know sodomy, where does that come from? Sodomy, when two persons of the same sex have relations. Sodomy, that comes from this story, which has often been misinterpreted in history as the city being destroyed for the sin of homosexuality, which is not in the Bible. It's a misinterpretation. Destroyed for the sin of inhospitality. You can see Abraham risks his blessing various times in chapter 20. Chapter 21, God gives the blessing of a son, Isaac. And so once he has a son, now we have to send the other son out into the wilderness, which is where the Muslims trace their story. I mentioned for a moment on this map of Abraham having a child now in the land of the Canaanites and having to say to Hagar, hey, sorry, but I now have a legitimate son with my wife, so you gotta go. And she went off in the direction of what today is Saudi Arabia, according to the stories that we told. Abraham's treaties, chapter 21, chapter 22, it was last Sunday's first reading of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. And then it ends up in chapter 25 with Abraham's death and burial, Ishmael's descendants in the south in Saudi Arabia, and the blessing is passed on to Isaac. Themes on page 138. On page 138 again, you see Abraham's travel from Ur up into Haran, the town that they named for their father, or perhaps better said, the town that we said was named for his father, and then going down into the land of the Canaanites. Major themes on page 138, two major themes. God made a promise to Abraham, and God blessed Abraham because Abraham was faithful. We always enjoy looking at other documents from that time. Abraham was not the first person to enter into a relationship with God. There are other cultures that told stories of their human heroes entering into relationships with God. That's at the bottom of page 138. Top of page 139, God comes to Abraham and says, I will make of you, this page 139, I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you become a blessing. See the blessings in the middle of page 139? That was our way of being able to say, God blessed us. God came to our ancestor, Abraham and Sarah, and God blessed them. And God will do the same for us. Bottom of page 139, top of page 140, starts talking about the different authors that we see in these stories. The Yahweh story, the J story, the Elohist story, the priestly story. For those who listened to our lesson last week, it's almost like it's taking the Bible and taking a scissors to the Bible and starting to cut it up and sort of like identify, okay, which words do these resemble, and put it into a basket. So we started sorting the Bible passages into three different authors, three different voices. One referred to God as Yahweh, one referred to God as Elohim. So let's just take our scissors to the Bible, and anyone who refers to God as Elohim, we're going to put in one stack. Anyone who refers to God as Yahweh, we're going to put it into another stack. So we can do the same with the story of Abraham. What we're going to do is we're going to see that Grandpa Rudy was telling certain stories in one area, Grandpa Joe was telling certain stories in another area, and so it took Stephen and Jordan coming together, the priestly class, to be able to figure out, okay, how are we going to bring together these stories and try to fit them together. As they were fitting together on page 140, middle of the page, the hand of P, that was the priestly class trying to bring these stories together. Interestingly, there are no colorful ceremonies, nor is there any dialogue between God and Abraham. God speaks solemnly as El Shaddai, the God of majesty. So not only did Grandpa Rudy have one name for God and Grandpa Joe had another name for God, but when Stephen and Jordan were editing it with the rest of the priestly class, they gave God yet another name, El Shaddai, the God of majesty. The priestly class is interesting, though, because Stephen and Jordan were writing in the time of the exile. Where were we in exile? We were over in Babylon, 600 miles away, where Stephen and Jordan were hearing all these stories of the Tower of Babylon and Noah and the Ark and of the Garden of Eden, etc. And they were busy writing down all these stories they were hearing and trying to fit them with Grandpa Rudy's stories and Grandpa Joe's stories. Yeah.
600 miles at that time is
From here to San
thinking
Luis
about 10
Potosí.
years
There we go.
to walk it.
Page 149 speaks of the faithfulness of Abraham. God promised all these things to Abraham. The fascinating thing is that why is God doing all this? Because Abraham proved to be faithful. Remember the first reading of God coming to Abraham and saying, sacrifice your only son, kill your only son? What? Makes no sense, but if you tell me to, God, pass me the knife. Sure. Abraham was faithful. That's at the bottom of page 141 where it talks about the sacrifice of Isaac. The Yahwist author's schema of the Abraham saga on page 142 then. 142 is essentially one person's telling of the Abraham story. Anytime we see the J, we see the letters J, E, and P throughout this. J is the Yahwist story, the one who refers to God as Yahweh. J is the German letter. If we were to spell this, Yahweh in German, it begins with the J, which is why we use the J as the shorthand. So there's the telling of the Abraham story according to the Yahwist author on page 142. The point of that story of the sacrifice of Abraham's son Isaac on page 143, what's important there is that God doesn't want your son. God doesn't want you killing your children, and that's important for Grandpa Rudy and Grandpa Joe to say because there were people who were sacrificing their kids. Right? If you want to please the gods, then I've got an idea. Let's offer our kids. And the gods will be pleased with that sacrifice. Think of the human sacrifice that occurred in modern day Mexico, back many, many centuries ago, right? In order to keep the sun rising in the morning and coming up every day, we've got to please the gods, offer human sacrifice. This story of Isaac and the sacrifice of Isaac was our way of saying, God doesn't want you to kill your children. Even though there are stories of this in the Bible. Page 143, it talks about the chapters ranging from Jephthah in the book of Judges, chapter 11, and Manasseh in the second book of Kings, chapter 21. You see that in the middle of page 143. If you wanted to read stories of child sacrifice, of people trying to keep God happy by sacrificing their kids, they're in the Bible. With the story of Abraham, though, it's like, no, people, no. Rudy, put down the knife. You don't have to do that. Instead, we came to this idea, instead of offering our kids, let's just offer animal sacrifices, which is where this whole idea arose of, okay, you've sinned, not a big deal. Go, bring an animal, bring a sacrifice to the temple, and the priests will offer it up for you. So Abraham and his family, they were faithful. That's page 143. Under the story of Isaac and Jacob on page 144, Isaac barely stands out. Isaac is mostly a bridge from Abraham to Jacob. We have all sorts of stories on Abraham. We have all sorts of stories on Jacob. Isaac is sort of the filler in the middle. Bridges Abraham to Jacob. Two key stories about Isaac on page 144 are his marriage to Rebekah from the home country, from the land of Ur back in Iraq, and also the birth of their sons, Jacob and Esau. They're going to have two sons. One turns out to be big and strong, and the firstborn should receive his father's blessing. Doesn't get his father's blessing. The story is told that Jacob couldn't see very well, and so when his sons, now grown, came to him for the blessing, he had two sons. One was bigger and hairier. In fact, Esau, the tribe that we said descended from them, were a tribe of red-headed people. And so we imagined Esau as being this hairy, red-headed guy. And so according to the story, when Jacob came to his blind father for his blessing, his mother said, hey, before you see your father and use your brother's voice to ask for his blessing, why don't you take these goat skins and place them on you so that when he feels your arm, he's like, oh yeah, you are hairy, you are Esau. That's in the Bible. I couldn't make that story up. Right? So, page 144 goes through the story of Isaac then, the birth of the twins, Esau and Jacob, and how Jacob won Esau's birthright. Esau was the oldest. He should have been the one who received his father's blessing, except that Jacob was conniving. Jacob cheats Esau out of the firstborn's blessing. That's Genesis chapter 27, verses 1 to 45, if you want to look it up. Jacob goes to Mesopotamia for a wife. Esau marries the Canaanite woman. God gives a promise to Jacob. Jacob and Laban are in contest. Jacob flees. Jacob has a vision. God fights with Jacob. Have you heard the story of Jacob's ladder? According to the, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. There was a song about this. Stairway to Heaven. Wasn't there a song called Stairway to Heaven? That's essentially how it was, that Jacob had this vision of how it was that in this vision there were angels sort of like going up this stairway between heaven and earth. God fights with Jacob. According to the story, they wrestled all night long. Like this angelic visitor, this angel comes, wrestles with Jacob. And after that fight, two things ended up. One, he like got his hip out of joint, and so he walked with a limp after that. But number two, he changed his name from Jacob, and after that was known as Israel, which is what we called ourselves. We called ourselves Israelites. Where did we descend from? We descend from Israel, another name for Jacob. All of us descend from Jacob. We're all these tribes. We have more in common, even though we are Ammonites and Jebusites and etc. Let's get along. We're family. Different types of Jacob stories on page 145. First, there's the conflict between Esau and Jacob, which were representing Edom and Israel. We were fighting Edom. Israel and Edom were fighting like brothers fight. So the way that we explained it and the way that we came to peace with one another was by explaining, okay, let's sit down and let's talk about where we descend from. I bet if we were to trace ourselves way back, we would find out that we both descend from the same family. Can we just get along? And so, pitting Esau or Laban against Jacob are really eponymous explanations, or the word that I've been using is etiological explanations. Where did we come from? Let me tell you the story. Right? We came from brothers who fought, so it's natural for us to want to fight at times because we descended from brothers who fought. But the important thing of the story is we descended from the same family, so we need to get along with them. They're going to do things that upset us, we're going to do things that upset them, but we need to get along with them.
Did the country of Israel existed?
The country of Israel exists not until the 1940s.
Well, okay, so it comes from Jacob.
The name comes from this biblical story. Fought with God, wrestled with God, and at the end came out with a different name. The story that we used on page 145 was how it was that two nations are in your womb, two people born of you shall be divided, right? Jacob and Esau were both in Rebekah's womb, fighting even in her womb, so it's only natural for us to fight, but let's remember that we come from the same family. Let's find a way to get along with them, even though we don't like them and they don't like us. We're family. Page 146 shows the Jacob saga in the patriarchal narratives, the various conflicts, various theophanies. A fancy word for God appearing. When God appears, that's a theophany. Page 147 again goes back to these voices, trying to explain who are the different voices, the different stories that influence the Jacob story. It's interesting because, for instance, on page 147, we note in chapter 35, we note that Jacob arrives at Bethel twice, in verse 6 and again in verses 10 to 15. This goes back to Becky's observation of Noah. Did Noah take aboard one pair of each animal, or 7 pairs of each clean animal and 1 pair of unclean animals? The Bible tells us 2 different stories, because Grandpa Rudy told one story, Grandpa Joe told another story. When Stephen and Jordan tried to reconcile them, they just put them both in, and so now we're totally confused. Same here. What page 147 is telling us is that when Jordan and Stephen took a look at Grandpa Rudy's story about when Jacob arrived at Bethel, and Grandpa Joe's story about arriving at Bethel, they just said, don't know what to do with this. Obviously, they didn't have an eagle eye to note that he only entered once. Instead, they just brought these stories together, so we see him coming into Bethel. And we know today that there was 2 different traditions of story that were reconciled by those who were editing. Another example, Twice his name is changed from Jacob to Israel, once in chapter 32, again in chapter 35. One was Grandpa Rudy's story, one was Grandpa Joe's story, right? The J story, the E story, brought together by P, who instead of choosing one over the other, put them both in. Brings us to page 148. The sagas that are told here, all sorts of stories of painting these people as heroes. And you start seeing these features at the bottom of page 148, top of page 149. Why this is important is that as Stephen and Jordan started writing down Grandpa Rudy's and Grandpa Joe's stories, there was some confusion because as these stories were passed from generation to generation, they sort of like got confused. And so all of a sudden you're asking yourself, well, who is the story really about? Because you see the same thing where it's Abraham and someone in power, where that person in power is desiring someone in the family, and then there comes this time of tension and the resolving. It's sort of like, okay, did this actually happen 3 different times in the same way, or was it simply the same story told by 3 different people who are now trying to figure out, okay, what do we write about this? There's a line in here that I like, but I don't think that I underlined it. Essentially, the question is, what are the chances of this really happening 3 different times in the same exact way? Or is it simply the case that whoever was telling the story was simply confusing different points of it, and we just brought them all together in the same book? Page 149 is essentially, that's the importance of the storytellers. Imagine it this way, instead of us thinking about it, being a book of history telling exactly what happened, it's 3 different storytellers and 3 different tribes were adapting the story to their local audience, so that some tribe who lived near, I apologize, that word is chopped off, quickly identified the powerful king with Abimelech, while those who lived farther south near the Egyptian border made the king Pharaoh, etc. So it's the same story, but being told with different characters in different ways. And that brings us then to having talked about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, now we come to Joseph and the Joseph story. Joseph is important. That's the bottom of page 149, top of page 150. Top of page 150, again, these stories are largely eponymous, or etiological, explaining where all of our different tribes came from, how they all trace themselves back to the tribes of Jacob, the tribes of Israel. The long story of Joseph is necessary in order to bring the tribes from Palestine into Egypt and to prepare for the Exodus. Where did we all come from? We all had this story of being set free out of Egypt. A dramatic story with great descriptions of foreign customs, psychological insights, dramatic encounters, detailed descriptions of Joseph's character. In short, Joseph is portrayed as the perfect wise man of the world. A great story we have in Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's a great story. Page 150. At the top, it talks about how the families united in the end, all in Egypt. That was their explanation for how we got to Egypt. It talks about the coat of many colors, which would have been typical back at that time. Ancient peoples were discovering, why should we just weave a coat out of one color? We could, I have an idea. We could try different colors all in the same coat. The knowledge of Egyptian literature, there are various other Egyptian stories that are told that have the same themes that we find in the Joseph story. So that book that I brought the other week of Ancient Parallels to Other Ancient Stories, talks about some of those stories. The Joseph story kind of reflects these Egyptian stories. But even more fascinating, at the bottom of page 151, is this story of how it is that archaeologists have found a statue in the city of Al-Alal in Syria of a king Adriani who ruled about 1400 BC. It tells the same story that we hear in this Abraham, Isaac, Joseph story of how it was that there was a king who quarreled with his brothers, think Joseph, escaped to a foreign land, think Egypt, where he was exiled for many years, received a series of oracles, think Joseph's dreams, gathered an army, reconquered Alalak, became king, and forgave his brothers, which is how this story ended, when Joseph forgave all of his brothers for selling him into slavery. So how interesting that we were telling a story so similar to the story of another king captured on an ancient pillar. Makes you think. Did we get our story from them? Did they get their story from us? Or, what was happening? All of this, these stories being passed down for generations before they were being written down. Page 152, when we put the Patriarchs and Matriarchs is the God of the fathers. This is why it's important for us to understand as we look at that map of all the different tribes, our way of explaining that we need to get along was saying, we may be from different tribes, but if we were to trace ourselves back, I bet we'd trace ourselves back to the same family. We're neighbors after all. And so the way that we would express it is talking about the God of our ancestors. Different, at the bottom of page 152, different patriarchal traditions know different ancient names for the deities, right? Some use the name Yahweh, some use the name Elohim, some use the name El Shaddai. But ultimately, if we were to trace them all back, it's the same God of our ancestors that we're talking about. Page 153, the insight that they had in the ancient world then was suddenly how fascinating that this is a personal God that has a personal relationship with people. It's not just about some God way off in the heavens somewhere, but instead it's about some God, and we'll use a lowercase g since it's different cultures, some God having a relationship with people. And so we often refer to the gods of our ancestors, these people. Abraham had his God, Abraham and Sarah. Isaac and Rebekah had their God. Who do you worship? We worship Abraham, the God of Abraham and Sarah. The God of Isaac and Rebekah, the God of Jacob and Leah and Rachel. That's who we worship. You may call your God by other names, but just remember that we all trace them back to the same God with a capital G now, since we believe that it's the same God. It's not as if they're different gods. Your God is not different from my God. We might give them different names, but the insight of Judaism was that it was a monotheistic religion, meaning there's just one God. So whatever God you believe in has to be the same as the God that I believe in, even though we call them different names. The God of our ancestors. I worship the God of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah and Rachel. You worship the gods of your ancestors, but if we were to trace them back, it's got to be the same God. Questions, comments, complaints?
Wonderful. You did a wonderful job here. I mean,
Thank you, Father Bode.
especially the way you organize it from the beginning. It's amazing.
So that
You
sets
get an
us-
A.
That sets us up next Wednesday when we come back. Will be the last Wednesday before Holy Week. Holy Week is all about the Passover. So chapter 3 in Father Bode's book talks about the whole Moses story. Now that we've talked about creation and those first myths, so I'm not using that word in a pejorative way, those first stories of flood and the tower and all. After that, we come to the story of the Patriarchs, and after that, we come to the story. Now that we've explained how we got into Egypt with Joseph, now the question becomes, how do we get out of Egypt?
How you
We
spell
have
that
story
last
for that.
name of the author?
Last name is Bode, B-O-A-D-T. B-O-A-D-T, Bode. So chapter 3 next week, which gets us into the Moses story. We had a story for how we got into Egypt. We had a story for how we got out of Egypt.
I can't handle it.
Enough for one night?
All right.
Can we conclude with a prayer? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, a world without end. Amen. We celebrate St. Patrick today. We remember the stories of St. Patrick being sold into slavery too. All sorts of fascinating stories that we've told around the campfire, generation after generation, about the saints and heroes throughout the ages. Have a good night.